Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's program, Bill Madden, who's VP of Logistics as a Service at BluJay Solutions. And today we're going to talk about what does great look like in logistics. Now, when I was a kid growing up in Brooklyn, the mayor of New York City at the time, Ed Koch, was famous for always going around asking, "How am I doing?" Right? And that's a question that many supply chain logistics executives ask all the time too. But understanding how you're doing and especially how you're performing compared to peers in the industry, has traditionally been a challenge. Can shippers answer that question today? What are some important or critical success factors in doing that? Well, that's kind of the main topic that we're going to discuss in today's episode. And it's great to have Bill with us in the program to share his insights and perspective on this topic. So Bill, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
So Bill, it's been a long time since you and I spoke, and I think it's great to kind of just refresh our memories and really provide some context before we kind of dive into this topic. Why don't you tell us briefly a little bit about your career path, how and why you got involved with supply chain logistics and what your current role and responsibilities are there at BluJay?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So again, thanks for having me. My journey, I suppose, like many, was more of a case of I didn't really find supply chain. Supply chain kind of found me. I started a business at the age of 18, building houses. So I was in the residential construction industry. I began to transition really into supply chain. I guess it was early 2005. Since getting involved in supply chain, I've done a little bit of everything, I suppose. I've worked on the dock, loaded trucks, managed drivers, and worked as a freight broker. But over the last 11 years, I've been working with BluJay Solutions. Since joining BluJay, I've held responsibilities, I suppose, in each role across our services group. And for the last 6 years, I've held responsibility for our logistics as a service team as a whole. This team I work with today, we have tactical and strategic responsibilities really for that end-to-end logistics execution. Further, though, we're supporting strategic planning, continuous improvement, really across the broader supply chain. Doing this today for over 24 shippers, and that represents about $3 billion in annual freight under management.
Wow, great. Well, going from building houses to, managing freight on behalf of, shippers there, on the surface, it might look like, big difference there, but I'm sure that there are learnings from, your entrepreneurial days and building houses that have, served you well in, your current role there. So let's get, right to it then. I mean, in the Talking Logistics episode earlier this year, with one of your colleagues there at BluJay, we talked about data context and the relationship between metrics. Why is it important, for shippers to understand these things, data context and relationship between metrics? And can you share an example of why it's important?
Sure, absolutely. So that discussion you had with Stephen Husk was really focused on turning data into business value. Great topic. That discussion kind of highlighted 6 key disciplines, I'll say, when it comes to turning your data into business value. That roadmap kind of begins with data governance, really kind of defending that quality of your data, and kind of walks all the way through adoption. I'm going to layer on a bit, and really kind of hone in on elements of having and understanding what the right metrics are for your business. The importance of using metrics in context with the market, let's say, and then touch a bit on kind of converting that intelligence into action, ultimately measurable results. So my appreciation for data context developed very early on in my career. As mentioned, right, I was in that residential construction industry. I served as a general contractor. And much of the direct labor that I did was really on the framing components of projects that I was managing. But I've always had an affinity for data. So I tracked things, right, and built reports to monitor items like bid frequency, what our win ratio was, future bookings or those committed projects, which in that environment translates into how much revenue can I plan on over what kind of a timeline. And of course, all of those things relative to all the standard financial metrics you'd expect. So towards the end of 2004, I really started to see some radical changes in some of my leading indicators, or those metrics I developed. I was still having opportunities to bid on new business, often enough to keep my teams busy. But compared to years and even just recent months previous, the frequency of those requests for quotes were a bit on the decline. Ultimately, my pipeline was starting to shrink. So even though my win ratio hadn't changed so much, I decided maybe to slightly discount my pricing model, again, with the objective of building up that pipeline. I was in my mid-20s, recently engaged, kids were on the horizon in the near term, and I had lots of people who were counting on me to keep them busy. So really, that kind of drove this decision to maybe exchange margin for some greater predictability. So when I made that decision, I was feeling pretty confident that that'd be a silver bullet for me, if you will. It wasn't. The change in my pricing model certainly did flow through to my financials, and I'd forecasted that, but I wasn't seeing any change in my win ratio, and certainly my project pipeline wasn't increasing as I'd anticipated. So, I went out there and talked to people. I had coffee with many of the local builders each morning, and over coffee, started asking questions, really to get a gauge of what others were seeing in the market. What I learned was that many of them had also adjusted their pricing models just recently, and some of those were larger concessions than even I had made. And kind of stopping there for a moment, that was a pivotal moment for me. The first time I truly began to appreciate there's influences out there at play that I didn't necessarily have control over. It also reminded me of something a teacher had said to me once. Behavior is a product of an organism in an environment. So to take that and kind of apply it here, right? Despite the changes that I had made, the environment had changed. So ultimately, the net was my output basically stayed the same. So frankly, this experience is what prompted me to consider changing a career path. Looking back, I suppose I made a pretty monumental decision based on that data context, and I'm glad I did. I was able to use that data to initiate that initial change in my pricing model, again, hoping in exchange I'd have more committed work for the future. I was able to monitor that pipeline with consideration to the changes I'd made in the cost components. And what I understood was my strategy wasn't effective. Ultimately, using that data to inform the decision to make a change in career path holistically.
I think what you described there is, similar to what happens for a lot of logistics operations as well, right? So you're kind of tracking things in your own little four walls, if you will, and you might think you're doing well relative to last year, or you might be doing well relative to plan. But going back to your quote in terms of you're really operating in this market, in this environment with competitors, so maybe you think you're doing well, but compared to your peers, they're actually doing better, in some of these metrics. So even though things might be looking, it's all what you compare yourself to, right? And I think for a lot of the visibility to that external benchmark has always been the challenge, right? So I think having that broader perspective to inform your decisions, I think is where a lot of supply chain logistics professionals are trying to get to do that. And which kind of leads me to my next question. I mean, there's certainly a lot of interest as a result of that in performance benchmarking today. And when it comes to transportation, the focus is typically on rate analysis, right? So are my rates in line with everybody else's rates, right? That typically is kind of the first order question that a lot of folks have. And there are different indexes out there right now in the marketplace that can help shippers benchmark their rates. I mean, how should shippers use these indexes? I mean, what insights, do they provide, and why is it important to benchmark your transportation rates?
Yeah, sure. So great conversation. And one I've had with many supply chain professionals over the last several years. Maybe another story, I suppose, to kind of tee it up. So growing up, I was a hockey player. At the end of each season, I had a pretty fair assessment on my strengths, also my opportunities, because I compared myself to others on my team. And I was able to look at my team compared to other teams in my division, and certainly my division to other divisions, all to say I had a pretty good assessment of knowing where I stood. I spent a lot of time in the off season developing my strengths, really hoping to keep that edge on my competition while still rounding out my opportunities. But I was working hard to be a better player. My core strength, I would say, was skating, agility, speed, which all boded well because I was playing right defense at the time. So while I trained, I wanted to measure my development, right? So ways I did that, I was able to track, am I running a faster mile? I'm able to put more plates on the leg press, maybe seeing seconds fall off my line drill time. But between my freshman and sophomore year in high school, I really put in my hardest off-season training, at least compared to prior years. And the extra work really seemed to be paying off. It was the time where I saw the most change in terms of time falling off my miles, line drills. I can even say I recall bench pressing the first time ever 1.5 times my body weight, which I was hugely proud of at the time. So, after varsity tryouts, when I learned I'd made the team as a sophomore, my confidence was off the charts. I distinctly remember a conversation with my uncle. He was asking, how ready am I for the upcoming season? And I don't remember exactly what I'd said, but I think I used the word enforcer to kind of describe how ready I was feeling. So I can imagine you can see where this is going. Once the season got underway, again, being a sophomore in that varsity arena, frankly, my stats just weren't adding up to what you might expect of someone self-proclaimed enforcer grade material. So why is that relevant, right? Again, an example of my environment changed. So despite all of my individual improvements, now when comparing myself to the world around me, it holistically changed my perspective. And benchmarking rates is similar, right? It gives you context. It arms you with information needed to really understand, but further differentiate your results relative to actions you might be taking within your business from those external influences, right? So as a shipper, you might be looking at a year-over-year lane level rate trend within your network, and you could conclude, let's say, rates have come down for you by 8% year over year. That by itself doesn't tell you a whole lot, because if at the same time, the broader market saw rates decline maybe 10%, well, suddenly now that kind of indicates your rate performance, the market condition comparison there, were actually stronger last year, despite having just published that 8% savings. So it's important in today's environment to really understand what extent of maybe some of the cost relief your business might be seeing today is a product of the market compared to maybe continuous improvement. And I'll say, those who take all of the credit this year may find it quite difficult in the years ahead, because the inverse will happen, right? So what to do with that data? It's really talk about it. For those that can articulate market impacts around their cost performance in an effective way, they'll be able to share that with their business stakeholders and give them that knowledge. So when the market changes, as we all know it will, we've got a few chapters in that book. So again, putting that into perspective, a few years from now, let's say we find ourselves measuring, again, year-over-year market rate increase of 10%. And as a shipper, my business has only increased by 8%. It's going to be hugely important that you've previously educated your business partners to really better understand how the continuous improvement efforts your team has been focused on have actually been measurably effective in mitigating impacts from the broader market. Those discussions are already challenging enough, even when you have a fully educated audience.
Yeah, you brought up a great point there in terms of education is such an important part of all this, right? In terms of the data tells you, the data is one aspect of it, but then interpreting it and then putting it into the context as you mentioned, and then being able to effectively communicate that to all the stakeholders internally as well as externally that that are part of that environment that help influence. That I think is critically important, because sometimes I've seen cases where you as a shipper might be paying above market rates, but there is a good justifiable reason, for that, because maybe on a particular lane, maybe you're servicing a very critical, customer, and you're paying for quality, you're paying for reliability, you're paying for consistency, you're paying for that data visibility, so many different things that might, factor into that cost, but being able to unwind that number, that data, and then be able to communicate that and explain that is part of the objective here, right?
Sure, absolutely.
Now, I think sometimes, particularly in transportation, there's always a lot of fixation on just the rates, right?
Sure.
Am I paying more? What's it trending? So this time of the year, everybody's trying to figure out, what their budgets are or what they should expect next year versus this year. We saw big differences between 2018 and 2019. But there's more to that, right? I mean, when you talk about benchmarking, there are things beyond rates that companies ought to be, or shippers ought to be, benchmarking. I mean, what else should they focus on, to gauge and improve their performance?
Again, great question. A resource my team has developed in the last several months really is a set of industry benchmarks. For many of the metrics, I suppose you'd expect a logistics professional to have in their performance dashboard. So things like routing guide compliance, on-time performance, what percent of your volume is flowing to the spot market, and. So we've adopted this capability really to be a standard component of our data analysis. It's been extremely transformative. So not unlike, rate benchmarks and what I described you can do with those earlier, we do a similar exercise with those service benchmarks as well. I was participating in a business review here recently with a customer, and as any good partner would, we were kind of reviewing what opportunities for continuous improvement we might focus on next. One of the metrics that fostered some really good discussion was primary carrier tender acceptance with consideration to capacity commitments. The current month's performance while on site for the business review was at 84%. And my team was positioning that this is an area of opportunity. This is somewhere we should focus and look to improve. Feedback from the customer was that they felt current performance was great. Maybe we should be focusing somewhere else. So I took that opportunity and just asked, in this case, what is your gauge for great? The customer had a very appropriate response and explained 84% was a strong performance level considering just 18 months ago, they were only measuring at 71%. And then further, right, they've had a long-standing goal for tender acceptance to be at 80%. And it wasn't just until recent months, really the first time in years, that they were meeting and exceeding that goal. So again, that all makes perfect sense. However, when we discussed the overlay of their performance with our quartile benchmarks, the conversation changed considerably. We discussed 18 months ago that 71% was considered third quartile performance, but only a few points away from crossing that threshold into a second quartile. However, in the most recent month, third quartile performance just spanned the spectrum of 88 to 92. meaning really the second and first or top quartile performance. The combination of those two only made up the range of those 7 points between 93 and 100%. So very telling, right, that the industry as a whole had seen significant improvement in this area across the board. So considering this shipper's performance at just 84% in the most given month, that pretty firmly puts them in the fourth or the bottom quartile. So I'll take that one step further. We talk about degrees of change. 18 months ago, that measurement would have to be below 20% to be considered low enough to call yourself a statistical outlier. Now, fast forward today, you'd only have to be below 60% to be low enough to be considered an outlier. So again, context is everything here. With that kind of a conversation and the data to go with it, they understood that 71% measurement was frankly much stronger in the industry at that time than the 84% is in current conditions. But beyond understanding just that spectrum of performance, or maybe the degrees of great within one metric, where the magic happens is when you really start to understand how changing performance in one metric might impact another metric. So I often describe the relationship between a shipper's metrics to be much like a balloon, right? If you apply pressure in one area, you're likely to get a bulge, at least to some degree, somewhere else. Working with dozens of shippers and leveraging this data into those conversations, we've been able to validate it's reasonable and achievable to be in that first quartile of performance across the spectrum and in parallel. And in fact, we've got a number of shippers kind of demonstrating that equilibrium, where all of those metrics are in those upper regions of the quartiles. And when you're there, I mean, you can get very surgical with how you use this kind of data. An example, I was part of a conversation with a shipper earlier this year, and they were challenged by parts of their business to drive a 7% improvement in on-time delivery performance, considered to appointment, for just a subset of their stock transfer network. The piece of that discussion that we spent a fair amount of time discussing was forecasting what kind of business changes might be required to get there, what kind of costs might come with that if they're looking to achieve that level of delivery performance. So we went through an exercise. We isolated comparable subsets, of their network where those performance standards were being achieved, and effectively kind of created performance bands, right? So 90 to 92.5, 92.6 to 95. And using those bands, we can then look at cost performance compared to the rate benchmark, again, by service performance band. We settled on collaboratively making a decision to make some slight tweaks in the business, things like modest increase to lead time to support some transit requirements. That enables us to make some changes to routing guides. Those changes in routing guides, we're forecasting a cost increase, we'll call it the equivalent of 1.5% increase in terms of that delta to their benchmark. And we believe by making those changes, we were very confident we could realize a 5% improvement in on time. So then why only 5%? Frankly, the difference in cost to achieve 7 compared to 5 was quite a bit more expensive. So we were able to go through and review, the changes required to achieve that original request, essentially tiering out alternative performance level solutions. And the stakeholders across the board, being part of that conversation, agreed to pursue that 5% improvement and considered that to be really the optimal solution overall. What was most satisfaction, for me anyway, was the end result, right? So the team collectively, customer and our group, was able to realize a 4.93 improvement on service. That cost impact only came in at 1.38%. Again, that delta to benchmark. So said differently, right? We were able to get 98.6% of the forecasted service improvement and only 92% of the forecasted investment. So everyone was extremely pleased with those results, and I mean, really, this is the kind of practices you can take advantage of when you're there. And I think everyone would agree this is really the fun stuff.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think those are both great examples there with the routing guide and kind of looking where you were at 71% versus 84% and putting that in context in terms of what that number really meant. And now this example here. And I think, the latter example also shows kind of the value of all this, of why even do this to begin with, because at the end of the day, it's one thing to look at pretty charts and graphs and BI, and we talk about all these dashboards and metrics and so forth. But ultimately, you got to translate that into business value. You have to take that and take some action of some sort to drive continuous improvement, to drive these benefits. So again, this insight then has to get converted into taking some action that the data suggests to realize the business value and benefits. So just looking at the data is not enough, or having it. You actually have to take some action to drive value ultimately. I think that's a good example there. Bill, we're running a little bit short on time here, so I'm just going to go right to my last question. I mean, going back to the title of this episode. I mean, when it comes to answering, what does great look like? I mean, what is the first step for companies? I mean, how should they get started?
Sure. So I think the immediate answer, right, is use a point of reference. You're missing an important part of the broader picture if you're only using yourself as a baseline. So whether it's through use of data like BluJay's FMI or something else, it's important to have that external context. Those organizations that are really achieving the highest levels of performance not only have that external context, they've learned which of those metrics are most important to their business. They make those metrics available to the right stakeholders at the right time. They also understand how all these metrics tie together. But to your point, I think what's most critically important is these businesses know what the operational drivers are behind those key metrics for their business. Maybe one just quick example, right? So routing guide compliance, which I would define as whether a planner or your TMS has an active routing guide that matches the criteria for a shipment. It was applied, that became the routing plan without any kind of modification to the waterfall or rating structure. Get that shipment accepted and executed by a carrier in your routing guide. So I'll pick that apart a little bit. What are the operational drivers that are at play there? So if your routing guide compliance metric is an aggregate a little bit low, just keeping it simple, let's say that boils down to you've got a few areas of your network where you've got very critically low routing guide compliance, while overall the balance of your business is relatively strong. In that case, I might suggest you've got a few broken routing guides. You can remedy that maybe through perhaps a mini bid. As opposed to if your routing guide performance was low, but that spectrum of performance and all the subsets of your network are all fairly comparable. In this case, it's less likely to do with a few broken routing guides, more likely an upstream supply chain challenge. Maybe your lead times aren't reflecting what was communicated in your last bid. So carriers are more uniformly unable to honor those commitments that they gave you. That might be leading to scrambling for capacity on the spot market, but really knowing what actions are behind those operational drivers and connecting that back to the data, that's where change occurs. So kind of wrapping up with just 4 succinct points here. Whether it's through use of data like the freight market index or something else, it's important to have that external context to really appreciate what great performance, or even the inverse, looks like. It's important to differentiate your leading indicators like routing guide compliance, your key performance indicators, which things like on-time performance. 3, it's vital to understand that balloon analogy for your business, how those metrics interact with one another. But 4, and maybe most important, really understanding the operational drivers behind your metrics, so you can drive change and influence those hard performance metrics for your business. This is really the first step in turning those identified opportunities into action. So great performance, it's obtainable. It's also sustainable. What great performance looks like will change with the market. And some people, frankly, will be more prepared than others to weather the storm when things get tough. But understanding what that looks like and being able to articulate that message back to your business is also a critical responsibility I hope people take from this.
Yeah, no, that's a great advice there. Great points of for folks to take away. And yes, I mean, I think that's the key thing here, right? What does great look like? Well, the answer today is going to be different than it was, a year ago. It's going to be different. The answer is going to be different, sometime down the road. So you really have to keep asking that question. You really have to keep looking at, these sources of data, particularly the external, data, to kind of have that frame of reference, that context. And then to the last point there is then actually being able to take some action to maintain or stay great relative to what's happening in the marketplace. Bill, again, like I always say at the end of all our episodes, we always just manage to scratch the surface on these topics. We provided some great insights and advice. So again, thank you very much for making the time to be with us today.
Yeah, thank you too. It's always a pleasure.
Great. I want to thank those of you that joined us. If you're watching this episode on demand, either at the BluJay website or on Talking Logistics, and you've got a question or a comment for Bill, you can post it there, and I'm sure he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.
Thank you. Take care.